Welcome to Let's Talk. Our session today, System Design, Applying 21st Century Science to Improve Outcomes for Children. I'm Debbie Mathias from the BUILD Initiative and the Director of the QRIS National Learning Network. Before we begin our session, I'd like to thank the Alliance for Early Success and other generous funders for making this learning community possible. We began this series for state quality administrators and leaders to support their essential work within states around early learning system building. We have colleagues registered from over 23 states and territories. We intentionally keep the sessions small to invite conversation and sharing. We hope these calls help us illuminate challenges, innovation, and promising practices. For this session, participants were asked to have an initiative in mind to relate to during the case study part of the session. Make sure to keep track of your ideas, questions, and examples, whether in the chat box or through discussion. We have a perfect size group to hear what's on your mind. Enter your thoughts in the chat box so we can discuss throughout the session. BUILD has been discussing the idea of theory of change with many state leaders. Where's your state headed with your quality improvement work? What's the goal of your efforts? When we've asked states about their goals, state leaders often say the goal of the efforts are to improve outcomes for children. Well, then how can our early childhood ecosystems foster the conditions that will achieve greater impacts on the development of children and families? I believe Susan and Tien will give us an important method of looking at our initiatives and possibilities about how to align them with our vision. I'm so pleased today, if you could go to the next slide, to introduce Susan Crowley, Project Manager, Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and Tien Ng, the Director of Leadership Programs and Initiatives, also from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. We're just so pleased today to welcome you and ask you to share your interesting perspective, tools, and ideas with us. And thanks you so much for coming today, Susan and Tien. I guess I'm handing it off to Tien.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Susan and I always find it a little bit odd to not be able to sort of see you or engage with you, but we trust that as we go through the presentation today, any questions or thoughts or reflections or insights that you might have will be put directly into that chat box, because we are very happy to pause, to discuss, and to engage with you throughout the presentation. So a little bit about ourselves before we start. Susan and I together lead the team here at the center responsible for what we think about as knowledge transfer to the field of the interesting and dynamic work of our Science Council. So here at the center, we convene 2 scientific councils a few times a year. And these councils are made up of multidisciplinary scientists. We convene epigeneticists, molecular biologists, sociologists, as well as developmental psychologists and economists. And what we do when we bring them together several times a year is we make the space to engage with them for the purpose of clarifying, validating, and synthesizing a robust and credible body of evidence that comes from their cutting-edge research and insights to date. And we do that so that we can get a clear picture of the biopsychosocial mechanisms that underlie development, health, learning, and behavior. And once that's done, we actually then draw on the output of this process to basically design our translation and communication agenda, working to produce multimedia materials, to develop curriculum, and to design interactive workshops like these in order to make the latest science and research available to the public in the field. So today, what you're going to hear is Susan and I presenting to you a set of core science principles that represent this diverse and robust body of knowledge that's been codified and translated in order to be immediately actionable by practitioners, policymakers, and organizations and systems. So we'll start off like we always do with an overview of the science underlying these principles, and then take you through some pretty concrete examples about how you might use these principles in your work to achieve better impact relative to your current priorities. But before we start, let me just put things in context. So this is me with my siblings and my cousins and a couple of our next door neighbors in Saigon, Vietnam. I was celebrating my cousin's 2-year-old birthday. We lived in Saigon where I was born and raised until my family and I had to flee as Saigon fell to the communists in April 30th of 1975. So anybody want to venture a guess, put in the chat box. Which one do you think is me? Any guesses? Okay, I'll tell you. That's me right there. So I was 2 years old at the time. Second from the left, close, second from the left, very close. That was me. I was 2 years old at the time. And then shortly after that, our family fled from Vietnam to the United States. And one of the first things my family did when we came to America was they enrolled me in school. And it was here in school, which became my refuge, a place that became a really robust holding environment for me, much more structured than the refugee camp where my family lived for a while, and to me, much more spatial, almost palatial compared to the 2-bedroom apartment that the 11 of us, count that slowly, lived in. So school, like I said, was where I learned to read and speak English, where I learned math, where I learned to play and make new friends. And school was also, though, a place where I learned that I was a Vietnamese refugee. Or as some of the kids in school put it, the yellow gook from Vietnam who made the U.S. lose the war. It was also the place where I came to understand that my family and I were not always wanted, welcomed, or belonged. And it was where I first learned about racism on the playground. So I share this to underscore that education, as I know all of you on this call know, is much more than the business of teaching and nurturing cognitive skills and strategies. But in fact, education is also the place that holds hope and promise for a better tomorrow. It's a leveler of disparity. It can be a safe and responsive community. And it was, for me, eventually a place where I learned, even as a refugee or an unwanted Asian, that I mattered to someone, that I could be safe, that I could make a difference, and that I could make a meaningful contribution to the world, and that I could lead. So today, as we go through our presentation, I really hope that Susan and I are successful in deepening your understanding about the biological, psychological, and social cultural underpinnings of development and lifelong health, learning, and behavior, so that you will be pushed and inspired to consider what you might do with science to innovate, to disrupt, and to ensure the promise of education rather than simply perpetuate a standardized industry of education. So like we always do, we start with the simple idea that advances in science help us create solutions for children and families that are much more effective in addressing some of the biggest problems that we face. So we've known for a long time that positive and negative outcomes are some sort of combination of supportive experiences, negative experiences, parents and parenting styles and genes. But what we haven't really understood until recently is how all of these mechanisms come together to produce those outcomes. And what we've been able to learn from our scientific council are the actual pathways that help us explain and understand how our social and interpersonal and political experiences and environments actually get under the skin and impact health and behavior and learning over the life course. So what we now know more clearly than ever before is that it's not a question of simply nature versus nurture or nature or nurture, but certainly the interaction between the two that helps us to understand what's going on and how things are going to end. And we know it also in terms of good news, not just bad news. We know that the interaction of gene and environment interactions, for example, plays a decisive role in the degree to which people can develop, build, sustain, and maintain resilience. And we know from the science that there are certain conditions that actually help to promote these positive outcomes in the environment. And we also know that the science tells us that there's individual variability, and that sometimes we can think of this as, what we might be predisposed to genetically that has an impact on whether or not we fare well later on in life. But what we also know is that pre-genetic disposition, which is represented by that fulcrum, isn't stable, and it can be moved. And that if we actually zero in on not only creating the conditions for resilience, but also help people, young people particularly, build and strengthen adaptive skills, we can tip that scale over to positive outcomes. And so that's what we're going to ask you to kind of hang on to today as we figure out how you might use the science of design to innovate and change systems in your settings. So the science of design is boiled down to sort of three principles, and we like to think of them as three very simple, actionable insights that you can use in order to design systems, implement program changes, and develop evaluation plans in order to produce healthy outcomes for children and adults. And those three principles are simply to build responsive relationships, to reduce sources of stress, and to strengthen core life skills. And so what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the science that underlies each of these principles one by one. And then afterwards, I'm going to hand it over to Susan, and she's going to take the group through some concrete sort of design activities for you to think about how you might apply them and contextualize them in your systems and from your roles and perspectives. So let's start first with building responsive relationships. We know that the well-being of children early in life is anchored in the experiences that they have early on, and that these early experiences shape their brain architecture. We know that brains are built over time from the bottom up, and that brain architecture is comprised of billions of connections between individual neurons every second in the first few years of life. So in every second, there's more than 1 million new neurons being connected and formed. And with every positive relationship and every sort of responsive interaction that adults can have with infants and young children, you're proliferating all of these connections. So we like to think of that as the principle of serve and return. So imagine, a grown-up looking at, or a caregiver looking at a baby and smiling at that baby and cooing with that baby when that baby is looking back at them. Imagine every sound and every sort of eye contact that caregiver makes, boom, there's 1 million connections being made in that second alone. And it's these types of interactions that actually shape our genes and the expression of our genes and the regulation of our entire biological and physiological systems. It's something that's very important to kind of think about. So this is where the idea that building supportive relationships is critical to health and resilience later on. We also know that relationships reduce the negative effects of adversity and toxic stress in the lives of children. So this is a study that was done by Fisher and colleagues who looked at the cortisol levels of a standard group of kids early in the morning. And we all know that cortisol levels tend to fluctuate, and they can fluctuate during the day, but the general pattern is that the more stable they are through the day, the better that is for your body physiologically, so you're not overexerting yourself. And so what they found when they compared cortisol levels for the control community, so kids who were not living in much adversity but of the same socioeconomic status as kids who perhaps were in foster care but in standard foster care, you can see that their cortisol levels tended to fluctuate throughout the day, and also started at a much higher level than the control group. So, which isn't surprising that these group of kids would be sort of on high alert all the time. What's really meaningful in this study, however, is that for another group, the treatment group of children in foster care who received therapeutic foster care, their cortisol levels were almost matched to the control group at norm, and continued to sort of stay stable over the time that they spent in care. So this is just a little bit of the science that underlies the principle, the very first principle involving building relationships. So building responsive relationships, just to recap, is important because the science tells us that it promotes healthy development of brain architecture. It helps to regulate the body's biological stress response, and it helps to promote attachment and social emotional skills for children that they can draw on for the whole of their life. It also provides the buffering that's needed to buffer the negative effects of toxic stress. And for adults, building responsive relationship also provides wonderful opportunities for them to feel a sense of mastery, of confidence, and competence as they are successful in caring for their children and getting the types of results that they want from them. It also helps adults to model really good relationship skills and self-regulation skills for children throughout their life course as well. So let's take a look at the second design principle. Apologies for that. There seems to be a little lag as I'm advancing these slides. So the second design principle we have is to sort of build core life skills for young children and adults. And the core life skills that we're talking about are the executive functioning skills and self-regulation skills that are foundational for us to do things like focus and sustain attention. As educators in the room, I'm sure you can all recognize the importance of that prefrontal cortex functioning. It's critical for setting goals, making plans, problem solving. It helps with impulse control, pro-social behavior, and gratification delay. And it's really important to think about nurturing these core life skills because these are the same skills that you need, one, to bounce back and to generate and sustain what we talked about for resilience over the life course in the face of adversity, but they're also the same skills that you need to be successful in life, to hold down a job, to be able to sort of manage your finances and your resources, and certainly to parent and to provide children with safe environments. We know also from the science that these executive function skills develop at critical and sensitive times in a child's life and over their youth. We can see from this chart that in early childhood, there are two critical moments when executive function skills are developing most rapidly, and that's in the early years from birth until about 5. And then you see another spike in sort of neuronal development through adolescence. And so the key take-home messages for you to think about here is that first, early is better, because that's when our brain systems are proliferating and most responsive to environmental input relative to the development of these skills. But as you can see from this graph, that it's never too late. So why strengthening core life skills as a design principle? Just to recap again, children need these core life skills for success in education and in social relationships. They promote positive decision making and good risk taking that produces positive outcomes for them. For adults, these executive functioning skills are the same skills that they need to thrive in a workplace. They're the skills that they need in order to be able to maintain a predictable environment and a safe environment for their children, and to provide responsive care, which we know is that really important serve and return interaction that's critical to strong brain architecture. And really for both adults and children, we know that executive functioning skills help to regulate and buffer the negative effects of stress, as well as to promote a sense of agency and competency and belief in oneself. So as we continue on, we're going to shift to thinking about the third design principle, which has to do with reducing sources of stress. And the reason that's important is that the science tells us that stress is a condition that actually derails development. So what you see here in this picture is on the left-hand side, that exclamation point is our stress response system, which activates necessarily when we see or experience a stressful stimulus. And it becomes a primary automatic response that we need because it helps us to mobilize and it helps us to stay safe and to get away from danger. Now, the problem and the challenge is when that stress response is overstimulated without the presence of a buffering agent like a supportive relationship and a supportive adult, it can sort of recalibrate our stress response system so that we are on high alert all of the time, which impacts and impairs our decision making and has really negative consequences for our physiological health overall. And that's a condition that sort of stays with us throughout adulthood, making it much harder to regulate ourselves, make it much harder for us to get back into sort of a zone of sort of safety and comfort and health, and takes much more both psychological energy as well as physiological energy to bring our mind states and our body states back into sort of that state of balance rather than kind of overwork from the stress. We know that toxic stress can weaken the development of brain architecture, but we also know that not all stress is equal or the same, because some stress is positive. Things like, needing to adjust to a new school schedule, learning how to separate from parents in daycare, maybe falling and cutting your knee a little bit and getting a little bit of, love and care from a caregiver to help you get over the hump. All of those experiences of stress allow us to develop mastery and competence and resilience. We also know from the science that there are some conditions and experiences of stress that are not positive, but short-lived, and so therefore they're tolerable. They might activate the stress response system in a way that's negative for us from a mind state, from a psychological state, and a physiological state, but typically in those situations, you've got the buffering of a supportive relationship and the benefit of a temporary condition on your side. So things like perhaps a non-contentious divorce, perhaps, the trauma of experiencing a fire in your family household that might displace you for a little while, but if you've got the right systems in place and the right supportive relationships, those tolerable moments of stress and adversity don't have a lifelong impact. We also know from the research that there are very specific conditions of stress that keep that stress response level highly elevated in ways that are negative, or what we call toxic. And those conditions are typically characterized by this prolonged activation of our stress response systems, coupled with the absence of a protective relationship. So stressors like extreme poverty or exposure to physical or emotional abuse or child maltreatment, chronic neglect, exposure to family and interpersonal violence, even racism, are conditions that are chronic and pervasive, and when they happen in the absence of a supportive and reliable caregiver, they activate our stress response system for prolonged periods of time, leading to really toxic consequences for us physiologically and psychologically. I think there was a question in the chat box about stress. Let me just have a quick look here. So the question is, has there been any research specifically on effects of stress and trauma for refugee immigrant infants and toddlers? And then, yes, thinking about how the principles are interpreted for adults can help develop a system that supports adults. That's great. I think that there is a lot of emerging research on the impact of the trauma of experiences that are associated with migration, either through sort of immigrant or refugee pathways, and I'm happy to send you some of that research offline. They would typically fall under the same sort of categorization of these types of stress responses, but I'm happy to send them to you because there are some. So just as a recap, why this third design principle in terms of reducing the source of stress, apart from what I just shared about the underlying science related to this principle, is that for children, when we address and reduce sources of stress, we are going to move children out of that toxic state or the tolerable states of a stress response and activate a stress response system and move them into those positive states of stress where they can, develop skills and mindsets to navigate stress in positive ways without negative consequences for their health and learning and behavior. We also know that for adults, when we can reduce sources of stress, we're going to be opening up their bandwidth and create sort of the resources and the savings that they need, the emotional savings and the social savings they need to promote healthy development of children. Having your life free from the burden of stress also helps you to think more clearly, which allows you to engage in more effective problem solving, planning, and goal achievement. And all of this allows parents to create and find and execute to more opportunities successfully for responsive caregiving, which again is that really critical early parent and child or adult caregiver and child interaction that we want to promote, because it's so critical in laying down the foundations of brain development and body and health development as well. So I'm going to pause here because that sort of wraps up the science underlying these three design principles, and see if there are any other questions as I hand this off to Susan, who's actually going to take these design principles and engage with you in thinking about some activities around how you might bring them into your work domains and contextualize them for a greater impact.
Yeah. Thanks, Tian. I think what we should do is maybe I'll answer, it's really a comment, but I'll just respond to the comment, and then if there's a couple of questions in the chat that are still on stress. So maybe you can look at those while I'm answering Andy's question. Sound okay?
Sure.
So Andy made a comment about how the principles are interpreted for adults so that it supports both adult family members and the workforce. And I, you know, what that brought to my mind was probably, I don't know, maybe like 4 years ago, the center did a lot of thinking about building adult capabilities. Before that, we were really focused on child outcomes and thinking about interventions that directly impact kids. What we realized, and this is really not rocket science, but what we realized is when you're trying to affect change in children prenatal to age 3 or prenatal to age 5, your intervention point or your target population is really the adults, right? Because those kids don't have agency. They're not independent operators yet. So we had a little bit of a shift in our thinking, and our focus went from little kids to the adults that care for those little kids. And then, yes, Andy, we've been thinking a lot, obviously, about adult caregivers, family members, so parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, but then quickly realized that the workforce that cares for these young children are also an excellent target audience, so that we have our target population. We have in our portfolio at the center, we have about, I think, anywhere from 27 to 35 projects, active projects that we are providing technical assistance to, and many of those are targeting either parents, which I'll use as a broad catchword for any adult caregiver, grandparents, et cetera, who are raising kids. So either parents or the early education workforce or child welfare workforce, or both. Because we really, as I said, really see those as the change agents for young children. So thanks for that comment, Andy. And I'm going to turn it back to Tien, and she'll respond to the questions about stress.
Hi, everybody. So Gretchen asked a question here. Do you know of any research related to early childhood workforce turnover and stress responses of already stressed children? I think that's a really great question. And again, we do know of some of that research, and I'm happy to send that over. We'll make sure that we get that over to Debbie and Jonathan to distribute out so that you all have it. There is a lot of work around, and it's related to the other participants. Megan's question about secondary traumatic stress. Currently starting to look at this and curious what others are doing to support secondary traumatic stress in early childhood workforce. Because our science model is organized around the negative impacts of stress, what your participants are calling out here is really spot on. So those different conditions of stress, positive, tolerable, and toxic, are also conditions that exist for adults in their social environments as well, with the same types of negative physiological impacts on their lives and in their decision-making and their psychological and emotional well-being if they're exposed in a prolonged way without access to any relief. So I think that condition certainly can generalize to the two situations that was mentioned by the participants on this call. I think the thing that you want to differentiate and remember is we're calling it out as a critical component of early life development, because what we know from, I used to work in the field of trauma. What we know in the context of trauma is that all of our response systems, how sensitive we are to, sensory perception, the degree to which our amygdala sort of moves immediately into a fight-flight response, the ways in which our brain regulates our sort of gut and heart and immune systems, all of those systems are being created early in life. And we know from the science now in utero. And so the exposure of infants and young children and women who are pregnant to toxic levels of stress without any relief sort of designs in many ways, right, the ways in which the brain will organize itself and establish its systems and ways of working for life. And that's why we focus so much on the early years. And as we said, early is critical, but it's never too late. You're just talking about sort of the same wear and tear in the body, but in the case of adults, you're talking about sort of an accumulated sort of exposure, wear and tear in the body, whereas what we're talking about is, designing those systems in place now with a 2-gen approach to actually prevent health and disease and psychological trauma later on in life. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Susan, because I can see from the participants that people are really eager to think about, how do these design principles actually work in program and system improvement? And she's got a lot of wonderful insights to offer there. So let me hand it over to Susan.
Great. Thanks, Jan. Before I go into the presentation, I just want to give my own little color commentary on the question about secondary trauma. And one of the past roles, I should say both Tian and I are not academic researchers, or at least I'm not. Tian is an academic, but we both have a long career history in clinical practice, so direct services too. So one of the roles that I was in, I was supervising social workers who were working with homeless families, and secondary trauma was a real thing. That was not a called out part of my role, but after being in that role for a few months, I recognized that, what these social workers were needing was to just download the stories from the families, because the social workers themselves were holding that stress just by the nature of the fact that they were witnessing with families the incredible stress those families were under. So we need to think a little more about secondary trauma and some look for innovations on how to address that. So that's just my little 2 cents on that. I'll go back to the script now, and do keep your questions coming in the chat and your comments, because we're super interested in those. Okay. So the center has spent about its first decade of life really looking at the science and figuring out how to synthesize it and translate it and then repackage it so that normal, everyday people like me can understand it. And we were pushing it out like that. We created this new product, this new translation, and pushed it out into the world. And after a while, people were saying to us, okay, cool, we got it. We understand science. Early childhood is important. The brain is developing in those early years like no other time in our lives. We need to do something about it, but what can we do? You have to give us more than just here's the science. We need to know what to do about it. So we did a little bit of a pivot, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, to looking at more action-oriented steps that we could take side by side with our partners out in the field. So before I jump into, I'm going to introduce you to a tool that we've used, and I'll give you a couple of examples of how we've used it. But before that, I just want to sum up this idea of how to apply these science-based principles in order to not just change systems, but also to change lives. And reason being that systems, programs, and practices create conditions and life experiences that get under the skin. And so the idea is that we can use these principles as a North Star, as design guidelines in order to change that, to guide some program improvement. And we do this, so we use these 3 principles, and again, it's reducing sources of stress, supporting responsive relationships, and strengthening core life skills. We do that so that children can experience healthy development and educational achievement, and adults can experience responsive caregiving or provide responsive caregiving and provide economic stability for their family. So the focus is on these three principles as a target that gets children and families on this pathway to the outcomes that we all want them to achieve and they want to achieve. Okay, so we have developed these tools, and we see, and we're open to others' comments, we see 4 ways to apply them. So the first is problem identification. We've used the science as sort of a lens to look at what's happening in programs, practices, systems, to say, to look at how much alignment there is with these principles, and then on the flip side to look at how much misalignment or out of alignment there is with these principles. So that's one way. Another way that we've used these principles is to help generate solutions. So we've, particularly when there's misalignment with the principles, that's actually an area that's ripe for innovation. So we might say, okay, how might we do X in a way that better supports these principles? A third way is that we've used them is to develop stronger systems alignment. So one thing that's really nice about the science and sorry about this pop-up here, guys. The one way that we can use the science and these principles is to help cross-systems, people who are doing cross-systems work, develop a common language and then develop common goals that support improved collaboration across systems. And then finally, we can use the science to affect the alignment of policy and practice so that there is better, using these principles to have better outcomes for children and families. Okay, so here is one of the tools that we use, and we call this tool very simply the matrix. And it's a way to look at a program and figure out where there's alignment and misalignment. And this is the tool that we're going to use for the 2 case studies today. So before we jump into the case studies, I just want to take a minute to orient you to it. And for those of you that had a chance to do the pre-work that we had sent out, if you were able to start to think about a unit of focus, please feel free to pop that in the chat, and we'd be happy to comment on those. So speaking of unit of focus, this is the very top of this matrix, and I'll dive into that a little bit more. But basically, this is sort of the sort of intervention that you're looking at, or the program that you're looking at vis-a-vis the 3 principles. So that's at the top, and then across the first row are the 3 principles. So building responsive relationships, strengthening core life skills, and reducing sources of stress. And you can see a couple of bulleted prompts to help you sort of begin to think about how these principles, what these principles might look like out in real life. And as Debbie had pointed out in the chat, we encourage people to think about the principles from a child perspective or from adult perspective, or both. And then this second row here is a prompt to say, how is this unit of focus, how is this program or practice aligned with each principle? And then the bottom row is, how is it misaligned with each principle? So essentially, once you're done completing the matrix, you have a really nice roadmap of alignment or misalignment with each of these 3 principles. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, go back to that idea of the unit of focus before we jump into the first case study. So this is a critical step in the process. You want to be looking at the right level of unit of focus so that you're sort of analyzing the right thing, you're solving the right problem. So one thing that's important that we've learned along the way is that a unit of focus is actually an intervention. It's actually a solution to a problem. It's not the big problem. So it's a strategy that's being used. Sometimes people look at this and say, oh, okay, I want to solve a problem for teen parents, for example. That's the target population that I'm thinking about. Well, that's a very compelling population to think about, but it's not easy to apply the principles to a population. You need to apply them to an intervention. So you might shift a little bit, pivot a little bit, and think about a program that you are using or you want to use that targets teen parents. So a couple guidelines here. A unit of focus needs to be, you don't want it either too wide or too narrow. So too wide is really like just a hard, too big a problem to get a handle on. So for example, if you said, I want my unit of focus to be early education services for the homeless children in my state. Like, very interesting problem, but a little too hard to sort of apply the principles to. It's too broad. And the flip side is thinking of a unit of focus that's really, really narrow. So for example, the form that a family needs to fill out to apply for subsidized early care and education is certainly very technical and could most likely use some tweaks to improve it, but it's not going to make a huge impact. So that would be sort of something that's too narrow. An example of just right is maybe looking at a program that you are implementing for homeless children in your state. So another point is that it's something that you can actually affect change in. So it's a policy or practice that you actually have some authority, some decision-making ability. It's kind of stating the obvious, but you don't want to work on a problem that you really can't do anything about. And then the third point is it's something that you're excited about, because honestly this work is kind of hard, and it usually isn't a quick fix. So you have to have enough enthusiasm to sustain yourself over the long haul. Okay, so we're going to run through 2 case studies so that you can kind of put some meat on the bone so you get an idea of what this looks like in real life. So these are both fictitious case studies based on work that we've done in our portfolio. So the first one, we're going to apply the matrix using the problem identification, that first application of the tool. And this is the Liberty Bell Early Learning Center, a subsidized early care and education program in Philadelphia that offers obviously early learning programming for kids. But in addition to that, they offer family engagement activities using a case management model. So under the umbrella of their family engagement, they offer a parenting program. They actually subcontract that out to a local program that specializes in parenting programs. So they offer that to help adult caregivers learn about using, for example, learn about using play as a mechanism for serve and return. And serve and return is the analogy that we use for those early interactions between adult and a child. So they provide, so they sort of hit on the parenting program box, and then the other thing that they do, the case managers support the adult caregivers by helping them set goals and track their progress during monthly check-in meetings. So they have a fairly robust parent engagement model, but they had this thing that Jack Shonkoff, our center director, has coined as constructive dissatisfaction. They felt like they could be doing better. They saw firsthand, they observed that their parents were engaging and doing their best for sure, but they felt like this program felt like they could do better. So they did a little bit of digging. They went out and interviewed families. They interviewed parents and other adult caregivers in the family using an interview guide that was informed by the 3 design principles. So they talked about things like about the adult stress. They talked about their relationship with their children. They talked about their ability to perform basic life functions, core life skills, or another word for it is executive function skills. So obviously they didn't use jargon in these interviews, but they did get at those 3 principles. And then they did the same thing with staff. They went and talked to their staff together. what their staff were seeing in their interactions with the families, and the staff's assessment of how well the program was able to support families, again, using these 3 design principles. And then what the program leadership and the staff, direct service staff did was they sat down together and did a 3 principles. Sorry, we've got a little bit of our own little jargon in there. They used this 3 science principles matrix to identify their areas that were ripe for adaptation. And they found some interesting things. So here's the matrix that they filled out. So first of all, just to be clear, the unit of focus in this example, they were looking at their own family engagement program at the Liberty Bell Early Education Center. So what they did was, so there's their unit of focus. So what they did was they went through each design principle one at a time, and they looked for both alignment and then misalignment. So under building responsive relationships, in the alignment column, sorry, I don't know my own animation very well. So they looked at building responsive relationships, and then they moved on and looked at strengthening core life skills, and then finally they looked at sources of stress. So in building responsive relationships in the alignment column, in the alignment cell, what they found was that their partnership with that local program, that local parenting program that offers workshops on using play to do serve and return was actually quite effective. The families liked it. They felt like they were learning new material and that it was directly impacting their lives. So they got like a checkbox. Yay, we're doing that. In the strengthening core life skills column, the case managers felt like they were doing a pretty good job supporting families to set goals and then monitor their progress towards them, and that resonated with the families also. They really appreciated that sort of coaching model. They felt they trusted their case managers. They felt like they had a good relationship, and that was going pretty well. Unfortunately, what came out loud and clear from both the families and from the staff was that parents were under a lot of stress, very high levels of stress, and that it was really focused on a sort of a technical problem in that they were having difficulty managing their daily routines with their kids at home. So the kids were having a hard time settling down to go to sleep at night, and they were often putting them in front of a TV, and the kids would just fall asleep in front of the TV not till 11 o'clock at night, and then it was they were coming in late for school, and the teachers were saying the kids were tired, so it was impacting their education. So that was their sort of the pain point, so to speak. That was where the 3 principles highlighted the area that was ripe for innovation. So just to kind of continue the next chapter in this story, this group went on to develop an intervention that where the case managers really focused on family routines at home and how to build them, how to maintain them, and support how the case managers could support the families in building and maintaining routines at home so that the parents' stress would go down. And they did actually run a pilot and measured parent stress, and it did have some good impacts on parent stress. So that was a pretty nice story. So that's the first case study. Before I move on, Tian, is there anything in chat that we might want to touch on now?
It's a great question. People have been really excited about what you've presented, and I've just kind of put in some comments just to their reflections. We did get an example from someone named Mr. or Miss Walsh, I can't tell, who is looking at communities of practice as a unit of focus and focused on reducing expulsion and suspension. So I thought that was really cool. I said, Susan's going to be teeing this right up. So as she's doing that, you might want to put communities of practice for your unit of focus. And then, go through each column here as she is for your program. But no specific questions.
Okay. Okay.
This is Deb. This is Deb. Hi. I have a quick question. So, in essence, looking at the principles, it wasn't that being involved in the family engagement program at Liberty Bell like was causing additional stress to the families. It was that despite the program which was supposed to address these three principles, it was addressing the responsive relationships, but it wasn't addressing the stress thing. So I guess what I'm observing here is that it's not about, like, did the program cause strengthening of skills? Did the cause, see what I mean? It's like the program itself didn't cause stress. It just wasn't addressing the stress, the underlying stress factor, right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you are,
okay.
And I'm really glad you called that out, Deb. It's a nuance that I was thinking about as I was writing this. But you're absolutely right. It's not that the program is misaligned. It's more that it's a gap in services. That's not to say there's never misalignment. We've actually run a matrix through with people with programs, and they actually, for the first time, had a big aha moment that they were a source of stress, not in a huge way. For example, if you have a program where parents are filling out the same form multiple times for different reasons, but under the same, under one umbrella, that can be a source of stress for parents. Or if they have to bring the same documents in multiple times, that's a source of stress. And that particular example is not going to probably change anyone's life, but it's also a very pretty easy fix. So yeah, Deb, to answer your question, it's true. It's not that the program itself in this case is the source of stress, but it's more that it's a gap in what they could be providing.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so let's move on. The second case study is what we would call it's a way to apply the principles in order to impact design or to increase impact. So in this story, this is a story of an RFP being put out, and we're using the three principles to assess the different respondents to this RFP. So this is Children's Home Society of America. I've been working with them for a couple of years now on different projects. And so for those of you that don't know this organization, they provide family services to a large number of vulnerable families and children in the U.S. So there's a national association, and then each state, or not all states, but many states have a Children's Home Society organization within the state. A lot of their focus is on child welfare, but they also provide services such as early Head Start, subsidized child care, et cetera. Early on, they had used the matrix as a group. They used the matrix to identify the problem they wanted to be solved. And similar to the Liberty Bell story, they went through the matrix and applied it, and they discovered that strengthening core life skills in adults was the problem that they wanted to solve. So they did a lot of thinking about that, and they mapped the landscape and found that there wasn't a whole lot being done in the early education space around building adult core life skills. There was some interesting work being done in other spaces. So kind of obvious one is workforce development. Another one where we turned up some innovative programs was in people doing work with adults who are incarcerated and ready to go back out into the community, needed some support around building core life skills, but not a lot that was happening in the early childhood space. So what we did was we developed an RFP, found some funding, and put out a call for anyone in any space to respond with their innovation, their idea on how to build core life skills, specifically in the early childhood space. So, for example, someone could come from the criminal justice department with an idea that they're willing to apply in the early childhood space. And so we got 19 responses, and they're all really pretty interesting. So now we're in the happy space of having to make a decision where we have a lot of interesting ideas, and we only have funding to move forward with a couple of them. So what we decided to do was use the matrix to identify the one that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck, the one that's aligned not only with core life skills, but maybe with one or two of the other principles. So this is an example of one. It's also fictitious, but an example of a respondent. It's called Fathers for Fun, and this is a program that supports fathers, obviously. And I'll go through the matrix, and you'll learn a little bit more about the program. So they did this, and they obviously the core life skills, because that was what this whole RFP was about. They obviously build core life skills in fathers, or they intend to. And the way they do that is they match fathers with a life coach who provides information on how to set SMART goals, and then the coach supports them in achieving those goals or making progress towards those goals. This program also has a component where they provide information to fathers on servant return and child brain development, so they sort of hit on that building responsive relationships principle. And then they have a facilitated peer group of the fathers so that they're able to use these peer groups to build social networks among fathers as a way to reduce sources of stress. So this Fathers for Fun, because it appears to be hitting on all three principles, I was going to say firing on all four cylinders, but I'll stick with the three principles, is a really promising RFP respondent. So out of the 19, well, we haven't finished going through them, but out of the 19, this one looks like a real promising one that we will probably move forward and support with some financial support. So just another example of how, oops, sorry, I forgot. This is an example of how the matrix can be used. So what also came up in this fictitious story is we wondered if there was a potential for this Fathers for Fun program to actually increase fathers' stress. And so we were thinking, in spite of the social networking or the peer group, so we were thinking that maybe we would go back to the Fathers for Fun team and say, could you add something else that might help the fathers decrease stress? Because to be honest, if you're asking a father or any adult caregiver for that matter to not only increase their core life skills, but then to constantly be thinking about how to build responsive relationships with their child, that's actually putting a lot on the plate of a dad who may already, be out there trying to work all the time, et cetera, and commute and all these other things. So we were going to encourage this team to think about additional ways to decrease stress in fathers. So that's an example of how
This is Deb. This is Deb. I have just a point about that, what you just shared. So what I'm hearing you say here is you can use the matrix to also go back and forth and say, how could an initiative maybe that you already have or that's going on or that you're selecting actually be strengthened toward the principles, right?
Right.
So,
right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good. I think that's helpful.
Yeah. So we can use it to, select a strong RFP respondent. We can use it to make adaptations to what we might call a legacy program. So that family engagement example, you're not going to get rid of family engagement, but how can you build it out? Design an adaptation to make it a little more aligned with the science. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Okay, so just to repeat, there are 4 ways that we think these science principles can be applied to improve impact. So the first one is the problem identification. So that was the family engagement example. Second is solution generation. So as Deb just pointed out, you can identify ways to build alignment with the 3 science principles in order to increase impact. The third is that systems alignment, so building that common language and goals so that you have stronger cross-agency collaboration. And then the fourth is impact design, so how can you increase alignment with these principles so that you have better child and family outcomes. So I think that is the meat of our presentation today. So I just want to run through a couple of things that you can do next if you're interested in doing more work around this. So you can feel free to use the matrix yourself. You can use that to unpack and challenge some assumptions that you have, and then either highlight problem areas and or make adaptations. You might be interested in explaining your matrix once you've filled it out to a diverse set of key stakeholders and get further insights. So you can talk to staff, you can talk to families, you can talk to your funders, to your peers, and get a deeper understanding of your alignment. We would love it if you share your 3 principles, your matrix story with us, and you can see our email address there. You can visit the center's website to learn more about the 3 principles. We have gobs and gobs of material on there, and we think it's pretty accessible. There's lots of videos that are really pretty short and easy to digest. We also have something that we call the Ideas Framework, so it's a program, a model development, and then implementation and evaluation model, so you can check that out. We offer workshops on that. Or you could request a facilitated workshop or consultation around using these 3 principles to do design and increase your impact.
You know, I have something that I want to add here, okay, if it's okay? This is
absolutely.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about is how state leaders in the quality initiatives, one piece of the work is around what type of initiatives are you going to deploy in the state for a variety of different purposes, right? So that, like, say that you want to think about business practices or the climate for teaching and programs and help directors think about that, or family engagement. You might have 2 or 3 programs that are, you know, specifically focused, like Vroom or Strengthening Families or whatever, on family engagement. And how are states and in what time periods thinking about how they assess the success and the continuation of the variety of different projects they're running? You know, like we probably, when I was working in Pennsylvania, we supported maybe 10 different projects. Your discussion about the research principles for children and, you know, good development gave me one set of metrics or whatever to be able to look across the variety of projects that we were supporting and think about, is there a way to tweak it to make it more aligned? Is there a way to, you know, should this be something we continue on, or is this one that we phase out as a stronger research-based program comes into play? Do you know what I mean? Or becomes evident or out in the ethos, you know, available to us or whatever. So it just gave me this matrix idea and the thinking about applying it to the scientific principles. Now, we know there might be other principles you're applying, like cost effectiveness. Have we saturated the market in our state with this? Is it, do you know what I mean? Or I don't even know, but I'm starting to think about what are other things that would come to bear as you were thinking about and weighing and looking across what you were gaining, the participation in the different initiatives, and how were they getting to your, you know, theory of change or your goals, really, you know, around what you want to aim towards. So I was just wondering if people on the call or our esteemed presenters here had any feedback about like the use of it kind of in a systemic way to help us as one of the tools maybe to help us understand and look across, because we're spending quite a bit of money on the initiatives, and maybe we also have too many in one bucket and not enough in another bucket, you know? So I don't know. What do people think about what I'm saying there with that question or point?
So while we're waiting for folks to weigh in, and I'd be very curious to hear what folks have to say about that. I think what I would say, Debbie, in response to your reflection is, I think that's one of the things that we have found really valuable about synthesizing this large body of science into 3 actionable, very simple design principles, in that to what the participants have been saying throughout this chat, you know, some programs might be focused on primary prevention, and they can use the principles in an effort to design strategies that are aimed towards primary prevention, which means we're actually going to try to just focus on healthy development over the course of life, and well-being and disease prevention. And so we're going to deploy these principles and align them to our program strategies with those specific targets and goals in mind. Alternatively, as many of the participants have said, you know, there's this parallel process where, you know, teachers are coming into the classroom and living sometimes with as much adversity as the children they're serving. And so in those cases, you can use these design principles in order to kind of think about how you might design strategies that are more focused on secondary prevention or primary intervention, right? So how do we improve things if things are already sort of really challenging and showing negative effects on a child and their families? And then thirdly, you know, if you know, you're dealing with a population or in a community where there are multiple traumatic stressors and adversities, you can think about, again, these 3 principles as elements for design in terms of developing strategies for healing and recovery, right? So in one context, you're developing strategies to prevent, right, poor outcomes. In a second effort, you're trying to sort of reduce, right, onset, or make sure that if there is onset, it's not going to be bad. And in the third one, if things are already really, really, really intense, you can sort of look at these principles through the lens of, you know, how do we help children and families sort of recover from the pervasive and chronic adversity and trauma and stress that they're experiencing. But I think, to Susan's point, you know, we put these out there because we think that it's really useful for programs and authorizers and technical assistance folks like the people who are on this call to be really, really clear and specific about, you know, what are the strategies you're deploying, what do you intend for them to address, and what are your ultimate goals and outcomes, because we believe it's with that type of clarity that we're actually going to sort of design and fund and scale programs that really work for a diverse community with very diverse needs.
Mm-hmm. And I can see people in the chat box getting onto that idea, you know, but to think about implementation science and emerging projects as they're installed, to make adjustments, that's really a great point, Andy. And another person earlier mentioned Mind in the Making, and we had that project in Pennsylvania, and really when I look at the core principles here, it really had something for the staff and then ultimately, of course, the children in each of these 3 buckets that was pretty strong. So that was an interesting one when someone brought that up in the chat box. But go ahead, Susan. What was your response, or what were you thinking about?
I was just going to say, to be very concrete in your original point, Debbie, in this conversation, where you're looking at multiple programs that you're running or that are being run, or multiple initiatives that are being run in your state. The way I would recommend using the principles would be to do a matrix on each of those initiatives and see where it plays out. See what it looks like when you do a matrix for each one, because then you can compare apples to apples. And as you said, it doesn't include things like cost or the resources needed to pull off the initiative, but it gives you a sense of the impact, and that might be a helpful tool if you need to cut some initiatives, or if you're worried about some of those initiatives. It gives you a very specific lens to look through and evaluate. The only thing I would add would be I would encourage people, if they're using the matrix, I would encourage people to then validate what they think by going out and talking to staff and talking to families. Because when you do a matrix, if you're not out in the field, there's a lot of assumptions that you're using. You're using your observation, your gut, which is probably good and valid, but I would just want to make sure you're not going then and building something or adapting something based on information that's not accurate. And we
maybe the matrix gives you what to take out, or gives you, the test questions then that you move outside of your own head, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
and
that's exactly
test,
what
right?
happened. Yeah, that's exactly what happened in that Children's Home Society RFP case. Was they used the matrix first to see what they were doing, and they realized they weren't doing anything about core life skills, so they went and talked to families and staff to say, is this really a problem for you guys? And the families and staff said yes. So yeah, it's exactly the way. And the other thing I was going to add is it doesn't have to be an exhaustive. You don't have to go and interview 100 families. Often we do 5 or 10 families in a really quick 15-minute, 20-minute interview. It doesn't have to be extensive. You just want a flavor and just confirmation that you're on the right track. I think those are all really great points. I would just add to what Susan is saying and what you're calling out, Debbie, that in many ways the matrix is really this very simple tool that allows people to sort of drill down to their very basic first principles, right? And those first principles, you can be assured, if you use the matrix, is grounded in a very rich body of rigorous and credible science about what promotes resilience and healthy development over the life course, beginning early, but always deploying later if necessary, right? And then to Susan's really good and important point, once you have an understanding of how your program might organize around those first principles, and if those first principles are meaningful to you and your community, go out and speak to the most important people, your frontline staff and the people that you're serving, to make sure that your interpretation of them and how they should kind of pop up in what form and how you should deliver to them is relevant and meaningful to the people you're serving, and then is feasible and doable by your staff.
Well, I just love how you circle back to beneficiary voice here, because I think that too often this is a step that we're skipping in our work. It's an extra step. It's sometimes what you get back is messy and not exactly an easy way to proceed or whatever. So but it is, in the end, are we positively impacting the populations we seek to serve, right? And I think that I just love that that's part of the equation here and part of the considerations. I do see a question about the matrix being available on the website, and I think you said it was, right?
Not
going
yet.
Back? Not yet. Okay. I thought on those links.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of science, but we're building out this 3 principles work, and it will be up on our website in the near future. But the matrix will be in the slides,
Yep.
and we'll distribute those.
Right. Yep. In fact, you'll get an email. All the participants will get an email. Jonathan said this at the beginning. You'll get an email from Build with the link to this recording, and in the slides you'll be able to see the matrix.
That's right.
Yep.
Well, do you have any final point for our group to consider? And just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your work with us today. It's very innovative, and we all appreciated so much hearing about it. Are there any final words you'd share with us as we get ready to leave the exchange today?
Sure. I think there are a couple. I'm going to start with one, and then Susan will wrap us up. I think if the participants today are going to take anything away, we would want them to take away that we know from the science that experiences and social conditions, so interpersonal experiences and social conditions, actually get under the skin. They leave biological memories, and those biological memories have a very influential impact on gene expression, on later health, on learning and behavior through the entire life course. And it starts, while that baby is cooking in utero. And so tuning to these experiences and conditions that are implicated in the design principles really allows you all as agents of change, as system authorizers and leaders, as program developers, field change agents, to really think about, how you can create those experiences and conditions that actually are going to interrupt and disrupt intergenerational transmission of trauma and adversity. And I think that's pretty special. So that's what we would want you to remember. And I think Susan's got a couple of little insights as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yeah, I think for me, I would love it if people held on to the idea of science as a design tool. I think sometimes this work, not sometimes, a lot of times this work can be very heavy. We talk about very challenged families who are experiencing a lot of trauma. But the idea that you can use these three principles as a North Star, as a solution to help these families, support them in their growth, is very hopeful and uplifting, and brings, it sparks all kinds of innovations, large and small, that can make a real difference for children and families. So I think holding on to this idea of using design, science as design, is I think a huge value. And then I think Tien and I both just really appreciate the engagement. We love seeing so much robust chat. It really makes it a lot more fun, because sometimes it feels like you're talking to a vacuum when you do a webinar. Yeah. So this was really fun. And feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. You can always reach us through the center's website. So thanks, Debbie, for inviting us.
Or if you do the matrix and find out some interesting example, I think I heard Susan and TNC saying they'd love to hear about it and chat with you about it. So
absolutely,
yeah.
We're always wanting to hear how people are applying it, and we're learning about this too. So we want to hear about your experiences.
We do, and we're a small team here at the center of about 30 people trying to achieve a very ambitious goal. And so we get stretched pretty thin, but when we can go in there and actually provide some hands-on technical assistance and support to teams who are trying to work at scale or in large systems, we try to make room and time for that. So if there's anything that you feel like is meaningful for you as you're going through this matrix and you would like a little more hands-on guidance and coaching, please feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to kind of chat with you and think about how we might be supportive in your success.
Thank you again. It's just been such a wonderful discussion today. Appreciate you taking the time and care to provide such great slides and great conversation and really making us think. So thank you again, Tian and Susan. Really appreciate you being on today with us.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much for having us, Debbie. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Our pleasure. Bye.